Our first speaker is Kenneth Gross. Ken is a professor of English at the University of Rochester, and he will be speaking about dangerous children. Ken.
You can hear me? Yes, good, great. First, thank you to Arnold and the Society for the invitation to speak. It's very lovely to speak to this particular group, given how much Alice and Carroll sort of saturated the book, Dangerous Children. I want to touch here on some things I discovered in writing about certain uncanny children, about the sources of their fascination, about how these fictive creatures can shift our ways of seeing, our sense of life, what it means to have a body and to live in language. I'll be focusing on Carroll's Alice, but there are 7 other children in the book that I look at, figures that shadow my thoughts about Alice. One is Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio, being so much weirder and desperate, more anarchic, and even violent than he's often remembered as being. He's a blunt trickster and clown, as well as an arch-victim of tricks. A creature whose life, whose impulse of life, joins together the opaque being of an inanimate object, the eerie animation of a puppet, and the unruly life of a human child's will and wish. Another subject is the child heroine of Henry James's What Maisie Knew, with her uncertain attention to the world of adults, her mysterious silences. Like Alice, Maisie is a curious child who is also an object of curiosity and wonder, at once unknowable and knowing. She begins pawn-like, but the novel shows her being educated into her own power, including a power to show adults around her what they don't or will not know of themselves. Then there's J.M. Barrie's Peter, especially in the novel Peter and Wendy, a child often oblivious, cruel, and piratical, as well as spectral. This uncanny child, we're told, helps to guide the ghosts of children to another world. He haunts the dreams of childless women as well as the dreams of mothers, even as he's disturbed by unknown dreams of his own. I also take up in the book the homely, impish, ungraspable thing, creature, child, who Franz Kafka, in The Cares of a Family Man, calls Odradek, a species of one who makes a father feel uneasy in his own house, in his own sense of mortal time. The girl child named Lolita is in the book as well. I can never quite imagine these different children talking to one another or playing together, but they form in my mind a kind of family. The fascination of these imagined children lies in their unpredictability, their unsettling energy, their capacity for survival and change. They show a fierce curiosity about the adult world while refusing to accommodate its rules. These dream children invade our milder dreams of childhood. They test our inherited pictures of innocence and of its loss. They make innocence at home within unexpected forms of knowledge, pleasure, violence, and craft. They create strange alliances between weakness and strength, seriousness and jest, sense and nonsense, the human and the non-human. Ordinary language can struggle to keep up with these children. They fall into conversations that drive them and those they're speaking to somewhat mad. They're given bodies that move with strange energy, flying, floating, falling, stretching, sometimes broken and burned, bodies that fill themselves with the strangest food. They're children who find unexpected occasions for play. They find games in places where games shouldn't be. Games whose rules keep changing or that change what we think of as the aims of play. Theirs is a schoolroom that is no longer a schoolroom gone awry, run by methods of teaching that are at best deformed, abrupt, impoverished, or insane. These children are often solitary or find their best companions in animals, kindly monsters, or material objects. Pinocchio and Odradek are objects, as well as things filled with fierce energy. What's dangerous in these children is no one thing and keeps on changing, like their forms of play. It can lie in something they see with terrible clarity, or something they're blind to. It lies in the challenge they pose to adults, to adult passions, imaginations, and words. Some of these children irritate adults simply by refusing their souls to be stolen. These dangerous children are also often, inevitably, endangered children. The dangers they face are at times only half visible, at others all too plain. These include the way that adults, for their own purposes, can make children strange, the ways they invent both the child's innocence and its menace. Their vulnerability can make those who face them feel unexpectedly vulnerable. The stories at times reflect a world in which, as James Kincaid and other scholars have suggested, adults turn their own fears into scarecrows or bogies to threaten children, even nurse them, rather than facing those fears themselves. It's often hard to fix these children's ages, or at least I found it hard. They can seem preternaturally old, archaic creatures, child adults or child suspended in time, children who age, if at all, according to a line of days you can't count or can't count on. These children may keep company with the dead, or return to us out of a dead life, like ghosts to be laid to rests, or ghosts that we should perhaps welcome. They thrust us back into stranger beginnings and stranger futures. They speak for aspects of childhood that may survive within us that we yet may have difficulty remembering. There is more in these children than any adult has been able to keep. They invite us to open up ourselves to invisible, forbidden, unfinished, or unlived childhoods. They ask us if we perhaps have not put away the wrong childish things. Down, down, down. Would the fall never come to an end? The madness of Alice in Wonderland starts with a falling. The child finds herself falling almost before she knows it. It's a slow fall, without fear or panic. A fall stretched out, shaped by a gravity different from that of Earth. There's time enough in thinking over spell-like questions or riddles. Do cats eat bats? Do bats eat cats? Time to worry about the danger of a dropped, sadly empty jar of marmalade falling on unknown heads below. Time to wonder whether you yourself might fall through the earth into the antipathies and what people there might have to say to you. Alice's fall endows a new world. It's a little like falling asleep, the thing that happens to you before you know it's happened. Down, down, down. It's a long fall through unknown space. She tried to look down and make out what she was coming to, but it was too dark to see anything. This falling never does come to an end. It's part of the being of this child, even when she walks on the ground of this new world. We as readers fall into such a world and into such children. And the children fall into us. We fall into a flood made of our own tears, likely to be drowned in punishment for weeping so much. A flood that threatens other creatures as well. Animals, commonplace, exotic, even extinct, though they all survive the flood and afterwards run an impossible race. Drinking an unknown liquid, we shut up like a telescope. Fanning our faces, we shrink again, almost to the point of going out like a candle. Or we collapse down suddenly onto our own feet, our chins sharply hitting our shoes. Down, down, down. And then we shoot up again, exiled from our feet, bidding them farewell, our necks stretched out high and twisting so madly that an angry pigeon mistakes us for a snake threatening her eggs. Falling and rising here work according to different laws, by a different logic. You almost fall upward in this world, possessed of a grave lightness. It is like the motion of a body in dreams, at once more free and more compelled. Such flight suggests a power in Wonderland to make real those things that the child at play only imagines for itself, along with the child's loss of power to control such play. Growing in Wonderland is never quite growing up, partly because growing larger is always involved in growing smaller. It can make you dangerous to yourself and dangerous to others. A new world of play falls back into Alice. We follow this child as she wanders, calmly enough, from place to place, without a map, boundary markers, or clear horizons, scarcely giving a thought to the world she's left behind. In moving to each new spot, Alice the quester may find a momentary place of rest, a refuge, a chance to tell a story to those she meets. But crossing the threshold isn't always easy, and each new resting place may become a place of chaos, a trap from which she must escape. Each turn of the story changes the conditions of the world she's in, including the conditions of what the world understands as nonsense. Bodies in space are as mutable as words in a sentence, run through by all the unpredictable tricks and turns of language. Alice wishes for a book of rules for shutting people up like telescopes. She won't find the book, though this doesn't keep her from trying to find the rules or to apply those she believes she already knows, even if they prove treacherous. In Wonderland, especially the rules that shape our play, the energy of play by which our souls, our imaginations and reason improvise and extend themselves into new forms, by which we rehearse our freedom and test its limits, these rules become radically unpredictable. They're always being reinvented, challenged, made unintelligible, though in ways that sustain rather than kill the work of play. The power that ruins play in Wonderland is here aligned with what creates it, in part because Carroll's creatures seem to set against organized games some earlier, more idiosyncratic, more unstructured impulse to play. Or else some of the creatures in Wonderland set themselves to odd, impractical activities that seem like games, even if they're pursued with a kind of vexing seriousness and solemnity, a power to wound, to provoke fear or sadness that we might hope is alien to play. The ruined games of Wonderland lead to fresh revelations of what play can be, hints of other passions or powers that play can channel. While playing croquet with the Queen of Hearts on that impossible field, with those running hoops, flamingo mallets, and hedgehog balls, Alice complains bitterly to the Cheshire Cat, the kindly avatar of Wonderland's madness. They don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least if there are, nobody attends to them. And you've no idea how confusing it is, all those creatures being alive, all those things being alive. You've no idea how confusing it is, all the things being alive. Those words of Alice, if they address the Queen's loony game, also speak for a more primal bafflement and wonder structured into Carroll's books. They describe a world in which the conditions of life itself, life in things and life in persons, are endlessly confusing, always crossing boundaries or breaking some primal taboo, spilling out in an unknown form. Life itself is the trickster here. In this, the Alice books seek to cultivate in us an anarchic competence, a flaunted, skillful incompetence, as Susan Stewart writes, a readiness to violate and reinvent the rules that define play itself, incorporating disorder into new forms of order. Alice's cry might be the cry of any of us, complaining about a world in which objects, words or persons don't function with the regularity or transparency that we want and need, when ordinary objects of use or play, a spoon, a pencil, a top, when these don't work in our hands, fall from our hands out of haste, weariness, or chance. Her cry also evokes the uncanny life that objects acquire when we neglect them or look at them outside of their conventional uses. One of the few moments of outright laughter we hear in Wonderland, it comes when Alice's flamingo won't keep its head down and do its malleting work, but instead keeps turning about to look Alice in the eye. But just why the bird's glance makes her laugh, we have to imagine for ourselves. Alice is a form of motion. That's her claim on us. Foundling, orphan, and exile. She's the guarantor of both our freedom and our entrapment. We learn the sound of her truth. The wonder of Wonderland takes its fundamental shape in our hearing Alice murmur so often to herself and us, "I wonder." We're drawn to the energy of exchange she puts into motion, her ways of moving through this world, her ways of provoking and animating its words. She takes these words into her capacious, acute, and troubled ear, often challenging the words, even as she finds her own voice less recognizable to herself. The world outside of Alice has something of the mutability of an interior world. It's as if she is at once traveling inside her own thoughts and looking at those thoughts from the outside, realizing how little she owns them, both hero and monster in the mind's labyrinth. In Alice's encounters in Wonderland, you can sense the isolate mind, Carroll's mind, as well as Alice's, pressing back against its limits, finding a power to shape and break its limits, to question the limits themselves. Time itself in Wonderland is disordered as a function of the world of childish play, but also as part of an adult world that can't recognize its own madness, that doesn't see how mad and broken attempts to control time can become. Alice is again a curious child. Curiouser and curiouser she finds the world, and we find her. That curiosity, mixing appetite and pleasure, harks back to something early. It's a link to more archaic, animal-like hungers, a reckless will to seize or devour the world and its creatures, to challenge their possession of real and imaginary food, even food that talks. As critics have suggested, Carroll's dream child in this finds her affinities with the cat and the snake, the smiling and seductive crocodile, creatures uncanny, secretive, and predatory. Such archaic appetites also mingle with things in Alice that feel more rational, her human eagerness to know and name the world, mixed with what in her is humanly prim, pedantic, despotic, and obtuse. Courtesy, like curiosity, is a trial in Wonderland. All that Alice takes for granted about polite conversation loses its grip, its truth, its apparent naturalness. We keep encountering breeds of courtesy that obey stranger laws, and yet still suffused, breeds of courtesy that obey stranger laws, suffused with the anarchic and yet deeply human energies that courtesy itself tries to subdue, organize, and ritualize, or convert into witty play. At one moment in Looking Glass, Alice takes both Tweedledee and Tweedledum's extended hands so as, in her own sense of courtesy, not to hurt either's feelings. She finds herself instantly dancing in a ring. This seemed quite natural, and she was not even surprised to hear music playing. Our almost metaphysical attachment to social convention is put to the test in the books. Courtesy is a hard game in Wonderland, just because of the readiness of its inhabitants to take offense seems so structured into this world, occasions for offense being endless and unpredictable. Alice laments, "I wish the creatures wouldn't be so easily offended." Yet the possibility of offense is a kind of glue, a magnetic field that holds the atoms of this world together, even as it divides them, sends them flying off into spaces of ever stranger isolation. Offense in Wonderland turns out to be generative and clarifying as well as wounding. It's a pathway to the hidden histories through which these creatures make themselves present to us, claim their names, and claim our care. Offense is the means by which they grip us with their peculiar magic, with questions about our own language, spirit, and forms of being. Offense in Wonderland allies itself closely with nonsense. The play of nonsense indeed emerges most grippingly within these troubled conversations, these trials of courtesy. You feel the nonsense emerging in sudden interruptions and angry corrections, moments when Alice's words are seized by a forced or inadvertent pun, by willful or misplaced literalism, by idle or aggressive non sequiturs, by impossible questions, or by inadequate explanations that claim to be final. Alice wants to trust the words she knows, wants them to be adequate to negotiate the world in which she finds herself. Instead, she finds words troubled, taken out of her mouth by odd theft almost as soon as she's uttered them. "Really, now that you ask me," said Alice, very much confused, "I don't think—" "Then you shouldn't talk," said the Hatter. Alice's plainest questions are turned by another creature into riddles, never answered as she wants them to be. "What tremendously easy riddles you ask," says Humpty Dumpty. When Alice has simply asked, courteously and kindly, you could think, "Why do you sit out here all alone? Don't you think you'd be safer on the ground?" At other moments, words emerge from within her mouth, altered by some process she does not understand. A familiar rhyme comes out wrong from beginning to end, spoken in a voice hoarse and strange, as if she were the medium for alien powers. Alice is often, against her will, a clown, and at the same time, Wonderland's perfect straight man, perpetrator and victim of a comic freedom she cannot own. Carroll's nonsense is transitive, endlessly evolving, collaborative and competitive, hungry and vulnerable. It's a prehensile, almost Darwinian nonsense. Crucial to the drama of nonsense are also moments when Alice herself shouts, "Nonsense!" Nonsense, that shout, can be a cry of rational clarity, a protest against a settled, authorized madness, an answer to its darker childishness, as when Alice cries, "Stuff and nonsense," to the Queen's sentence first, verdict afterwards. The cry "nonsense" also puts away the threat of something you don't understand. You shout nonsense in response to a nasty, overgrown child who insists you'll disappear like a blown-out candle when the king who dreams your existence wakes up. Saying nonsense there keeps at bay the thought of death. Indeed, much of Carroll's nonsense seems like a mind at once embracing and pressing back against the apparent senselessness of being, even as it mocks the lunacy of nonsense disguised as reason and fact. Alice must learn to trust words differently, to question how others trust them and make use of them, what it is they name. The eerie poetry of this comes through in her talk with the Mock Turtle about her schooling. In place of history, ancient and modern, the weeping creature boasts that he was taught mystery, ancient and modern. That's a joke about the empirical ambitions of history itself. It reminds you that mystery has a history, even as it mocks any attempt to categorize and teach mysterious matters. And then the turtle's basic arithmetic wasn't addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, but ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. The words can sound like pretentious malapropisms, as William Empson suggested, or like the deformations of dreams, or like the mistakes created in the game called telephone or whisper down the lane, where you pass a whispered phrase secretly from ear to ear and wait to see the monster that emerges at the end. The Mock Turtle's words also invite us to think more about just how we learn certain things, to think of ambition and derision, of our power to make things ugly as fundamental skills we learn as children, things adults teach children rather than being instinctive or automatic. Who or what instructs us, not in Latin and Greek, but in laughing and grief. For all their disorder and strangeness, such conversations tie Alice more closely to the creatures she meets, even as they shift her within herself. Conversation in Carroll works at the threshold of contact between private and public, revealing unknown sides of both. It lives between will and compulsion, free play and mechanism. The smallest turn of speech can become a rabbit hole into which we fall, as if we had to learn language again from the ground up. You see, the Earth takes 24 hours to turn on its axis. Talking of axis, said the Duchess, chop off her head. Conversation in Wonderland sends forth unknown nerves of thought, finding out curious points of contact between very different speakers. For all that this kind of talk plays out across polite surfaces, something that the French poet and actor Antonin Artaud deplored in Carroll's work, nonsense conversation can become intimate, tactile. It's like the shared skin of language, charged with sensitivity to inward and outward touch, or like the shared element of air that flows between us. It gives to just words a power to touch or call to a place within us that stirs up a complex combination of pleasure, hunger, and irritability. A combination always hard to name. All adults have been children, writes Gillian Beer. They are in dialogue with their past, which is also lost to them. Much of Alice's conversation is conducted within this nimbus of the irrecoverable. If courtesy in Wonderland is bound to offense, and offense to nonsense, nonsense is bound to silence. Silence in Carroll gives nonsense a crucial edge. The shifting conduct of words is shaped by countless intervals where there are no words. The silences come unpredictably at the start of a conversation or in the middle, or they can bring it suddenly to an end. Suddenly to an end. You can't always say how spontaneous or calculated the silences are. They evoke time remembered and time foreseen, or a present moment uncannily stretched out. They can last, in Carroll's indications, a minute or two, a while, or a long time, intervals left for us as readers to imagine. Some silences are calm, echoing the child at play. Others are bound to bafflement and anger, to shame and fear, including a fear of talking nonsense. The silences settle into bodies. They invite you to feel what in these creatures is mute, alien, and unseen, like pieces of the noisy silence of infant minds before language joins in. Carroll suggests the ways in which silence interrupts, suspends, or syncopates our experience, and how this can shed unsettling light on the unexamined lives that we so often turn out to be living. He lets you feel silence as part of the madness of all speaking. Silence in the Alice books is often transitive, as Paolo Valesio writes in his book, Listen to the Silence. That is, it's a silence shaped by acts of silencing, both intentional and unconscious. There's the silencing of your own speech that comes from being amidst so many creatures speaking all at once. There's the silence that comes from being suddenly interrupted by another person's words, and the silence that comes from another person's failure to respond to your words, Or when you find your own words say both more and less than you intended. Alice is often silenced, and she willfully holds her tongue, silencing herself. In both cases, she's thrown back into the conditions of an infant. Infans in Latin means speechless. Even as this silence opens up our sense of her inner world, her unspoken negotiations with herself. Alice said nothing. She had never been so contradicted in her life before, and she felt as if she were losing her temper. This silenced child also learns how to silence others. "Nonsense," said Alice, very loudly and decidedly, and the Queen was silent. The silences of the Alice books build on and provoke one another, like the games of nonsense. Hearing and not hearing, speaking and silence dance together. Words show themselves in Wonderland as the impish doubles of silence. Or we see how speech carries with it shreds of the silence from which it's been plucked. "Your hair wants cutting," said the Hatter. He had been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, and this was his first speech. "You should learn not to make personal remarks," Alice said with some severity. "It's very rude." The Hatter opened his eyes very wide on hearing this, but all he said was, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" The Hatter's silent gaze makes more of a wonder and riddle of Alice herself, even as it makes his wonder at her harder to read. Like cats in the ruins of Rome, silences turn up everywhere in the Alice books once you start to look for them. Here are a few more instances from Wonderland. "I don't believe it," said the pigeon. "But if they do, why then they're a kind of serpent. That's all I can say." This was such a new idea to Alice, she was quite silent for a minute or two. The caterpillar and Alice looked at each other for some time in silence. At last the caterpillar took the hookah out of its mouth and addressed her in a languid, sleepy voice. "Who are you?" said the caterpillar. This was not an engaging opening for conversation. "Then the words don't fit you," said the king, looking around the court with a smile. There was dead silence. "It is the same thing with you," said the Hatter. And here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a minute, while Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't much. "Once," said the Mock Turtle, at last, with a sigh, "I was a real turtle." These words were followed by a very long silence, broken only by the occasional exclamation of HJCKRRH, exclamation point, from the griffin, and the constant heavy sobbing of the Mock Turtle. Alice was very nearly getting up and saying, "Thank you, sir, for your interesting story," but she could not help thinking there must be more to come. So she sat still and said nothing. In this last example, wordless noises from both creatures break into and intensify the silence, gesturing towards other occasions for talk, other stories that we have to guess at. Some kinds of silence are harder to hear in Wonderland. You can hear the silence of a child at play, plotting mischief or holding back tears. You don't hear the silence of the spy at work in the dark, the silence of the murderer stalking his prey, or the silence of the paranoid lunatic imagining himself the victim of both. You don't hear the silence of the prisoner who's been gagged, or the silence of the prisoner who wills silence, who holds her tongue, refusing to respond to an interrogator. Do you ever hear the silence that sits between lovers? The terrible muteness of the dead is barely hinted at. Spectral as some Wonderland creatures are, I don't hear in the book the silence of ghosts. I hear the silence of many kinds of wonder, but I don't hear the silence of sublime awe, the silence of deep conversation, or the silence of the sacred. You might hear in the Alice books the silencing of some more unsettling, more visceral human impulses. There are moments when, clamoring below the surface of a pun or a piece of nonsense, you can hear the echo of fiercer rages and longings. Such feelings may belong variously to the domain of the child and that of the adult, or to some place where child and adult lives cross. Yet even the most troubling silence in the Alice books always feel to me humanizing and generative, rather than simply being signs of evasion or repression. They're never absolute or final silences. Carroll's writing invites these silences to be part of the world of play. They live in spaces between human speakers as well as inside them. They belong to the shared domain of our best and worst conversations. They're part of our stranger courtesies, even if courting offense. Alice is herself a crucial magnet or lightning rod for these silences, even if they don't belong to her. Without Alice's presence, we'd not be in a position to hear the silences at all. One last thought by way of ending. Like some readers, I'm struck by the sad, self-wounding, even creepy nostalgia for the child that plays a part in the poems that Carroll wrote to frame the Alice books, his prologues and epilogues. These evoke more and more, as the books unfold, sorrow for the tale's vanished origin in innocence and wonder, as well as a dread of future time, whether it brings adult sexuality or death. In the epilogue to Looking Glass, the dream child survives at best as a specter, severed from the living child. Still I see her phantom-wise, Alice moving under skies never seen by mortal eyes, as if she had always been a ghost. But I must say that I rarely feel such notes of self-wounding, even vengeful nostalgia in the books proper. It's as if the framing poems helped Carroll to isolate such feelings and siphon them off. The tales themselves are so fiercely present to the consciousness of the child Alice, which is also Carroll's own consciousness, what survives in him as of a child, and more than a child, madly articulate and madly playful. Touches of fear and sorrow, anger and self-pity do enter the tales and their more nonsensical poems. They hover in the book's silences, in the oblique references to dying, in Alice's frustrations, in the continual flight or vanishing of the desired things. But those darker strains are also always lightened, freed up, crossed with wilder and more curious games of language. There's an appetite for living in time as well as a fear of time, a readiness to mock the self in the face of its own losses and those of the world. At any moment, we find ourselves back at a place of emergent possibility, a stark beginning and not just a vanished place of origin or a dead past that infects the present. Within the stories, a relentless, undying sense of play rings clearly, fearlessly, shamelessly. The remembered face of the aged man in the Song of the White Knight, Carroll's own earnest, clownish avatar as storyteller and inventor, this face is distracted with its woe. Yet the old man has eyes of fire, eyes like cinders all aglow, and an eager voice that snorted like a buffalo with a stammer like Dodgson's own. Here, Alice, moving under skies, is not the phantom of a lost listener, but a lasting motion of life. And those skies are still ours. Thank you. Yes?
So I read the introduction of your book in which you give a description of what you consider dangerous children, and also in some examples about what children in literature were not really considered dangerous, but then some of them that you could have also included on the book but didn't. So I guess my question is, why Alice? What is it about Alice that made you want to include her as a dangerous child?
Why Alice? That's a good question. I don't think I ever asked that question. It's just like she was there. And sort of at the start of this line or genealogy of books, both adult and children's books, which created this figure who for me is both child and adult, whose energies of thinking and play and reason and whose encounters with madness just seemed the starting point. So that's really, I hope that helps. I mean, we can talk more afterwards, but again, thank you very much.